He was the cleverest man of his age, the one whose mind, not whose sword, had finally brought down the great walls of Troy after 10 long years of war. And when at last that war was over, he set sail for home, for his island, his wife, his son, a journey that should have taken only a few short weeks. Instead, it took him 10 years, 10 more years of monsters and witches, of shipwrecks and the land of the dead, of losing every single man who sailed with him. Why? What could keep the smartest hero in all the world lost upon the sea for an entire decade? The answer is that he had angered a god, and that no cunning, however great, can outrun the sea when the sea itself wants you drowned. This is the story of the longest journey home ever told, of a man who lost everything and refused, year after year, to stop trying to reach the one place that still called to him. And to understand why the sea would not let him go, we must return to a burning city and a single act of pride on the night that Troy fell. High on Olympus, the gods themselves had already taken sides in his fate. The goddess Athena, who loved Odysseus for his cleverness, pleaded his cause before her father Zeus, asking why so good a man should suffer so long, so far from home. But one god would not relent. Poseidon, the lord of the sea, nursed a grudge that would not cool, and as long as his anger lasted, every wave and every wind stood ready to turn against the wanderer. And so the whole story hangs upon a quarrel among the gods. One who would carry Odysseus home, and one who would drown him if he could, and a mortal man caught between them on the wide and pitiless sea. When Troy was sacked and its towers thrown down, the victorious Greeks did a foolish thing. In the madness of their triumph, they forgot to honor the gods who had granted them the victory. They plundered the temples. They shed blood in the sanctuaries. And the goddess Athena, who had favored the Greeks all through the war, turned her face from them in anger. So, the fleet that sailed home from Troy did not sail with the blessing of the heavens, but under their frown. Many of the great heroes would never reach their homes at all, and one man in particular, the cleverest of them all, Odysseus, king of the little rocky island of Ithaca, was about to begin a journey that would test him beyond anything the war had ever asked. Their troubles began almost at once. The very first land they came to, after leaving Troy, was a city called Ismarus, and there, still hungry for the plunder of war, Odysseus and his men stormed the town and seized its treasure. But instead of leaving swiftly, the men lingered on the beach to feast and drink, deaf to Odysseus' warnings. And while they reveled, and survivors fetched help from inland, and fell upon the drunken Greeks at dawn, many good men were killed before they could scramble back to their ships and flee. It was the first lesson of the long journey, and one his crew would never truly learn: that their own recklessness, their own greed, and lack of restraint would prove far more deadly to them than any enemy. Again and again, in the years to come, it would not be monsters that destroyed the men of Ithaca. It would be themselves. At first, it seemed an ordinary voyage. Odysseus set out with 12 ships and all his loyal men, their holds full of the spoils of Troy, their hearts set on home. But the sea is never simple for a man the gods have marked. A great storm swept them off course driving them for days across unknown waters, until they came to a strange and drowsy land. The people there ate nothing but the fruit of a curious plant, the lotus, and when some of Odysseus's men went ashore and tasted it, a heavy peace came over them. They forgot their homes. They forgot their families. They forgot that they had ever wanted to leave at all, and wished only to stay in that dreaming land and eat the lotus forever. Odysseus had to drag them back to the ships by force, weeping, and bind them beneath the benches, and row hard away from that shore. It was the first of many temptations, and it would not be the last time that the greatest danger his men faced was the desire to simply give up and stop and forget the long road home. It is a strange and quiet kind of monster, this one. No teeth, no claws, only a sweetness that makes a man lay his burdens down and cease to care. And it is the temptation that shadows the whole of the journey. In every land they came to, in one form or another, the same soft voice would whisper to Odysseus and his men, "Stay here, rest here, forget the sea and the long way home." Simply to keep going at all against that gentle voice was its own quiet kind of heroism. Their next landing would be far more terrible. They came to the island of the Cyclops, a race of enormous one-eyed giants who kept flocks of sheep, who built no ships and made no laws, and who had no fear of gods or men. Odysseus, curious as ever, took 12 of his best men and went ashore to explore a great cave, hoping the owner might offer them the gifts a host owed a guest. But the owner was Polyphemus, a Cyclops the size of a mountain, and a son of the sea god Poseidon himself. When the giant returned with his flocks and rolled a vast stone across the mouth of the cave, a stone so huge that no mortal could ever move it, the men were trapped. And when Polyphemus saw them, he did not offer them gifts. He seized 2 of them in his enormous hands and devoured them on the spot, and then lay down to sleep among his sheep, with the Greeks sealed inside, waiting to be eaten. Odysseus's men had begged him to leave the moment they saw the size of that cave, to snatch some cheeses and a few lambs, and flee back to the ship before the owner returned. But Odysseus, curious to the point of recklessness, had wanted to see the giant, and to receive the gifts a host was bound by the laws of the gods to give a guest. It was a decision that cost 2 men their lives before his eyes, and trapped the rest behind a stone that 20 men could not have shifted. Now, in the reeking dark of that cave, surrounded by the giant's sheep and the bones of the eaten, the cleverest man in the world had to think faster than he ever had in all his life. Here, cunning was the only weapon left. Odysseus could not simply kill the giant in his sleep, for then no one could move the great stone from the door, and they would all die trapped in the dark. So he devised a plan. He offered the Cyclops a skin of strong, unwatered wine, stronger than anything the giant had ever tasted. And Polyphemus drank greedily and asked the stranger his name. And Odysseus, cleverest of men, gave a clever answer. "My name," he said, "is Nobody." When the wine had done its work, and the giant fell into a drunken sleep, Odysseus and his men took a great stake of olive wood they had sharpened and hardened in the fire, and they drove its burning point deep into the Cyclops' single eye and blinded him. It hissed like a smith's hot iron plunged into cold water, and the great eye burst, and the giant's scream was so vast and so terrible that the men shrank back against the cave walls in terror, even as their hearts leapt with a desperate hope. Polyphemus woke roaring in agony, and his cries brought the other Cyclops running to the cave. "Who is hurting you?" they called through the stone. "Who is killing you?" And the blinded giant bellowed back the only name he knew: "Nobody. Nobody is killing me." And so his neighbors, hearing that nobody was hurting him, shrugged and wandered away, and left him to his pain. The trick had worked perfectly. In the morning, the blinded giant had to let his sheep out to graze. So he rolled back the stone and sat in the doorway, running his hands over the back of each animal, to make sure the men did not escape among them. But Odysseus had thought of this too. He tied his men beneath the bellies of the great rams, 3 sheep to each man, and clung beneath the largest ram himself, and so they passed out under the giant's searching hands and escaped to their ship. And it should have ended there, a perfect escape, a victory of wits over brute strength. But as they rowed away, Odysseus made the one mistake that would cost him everything. His pride would not let the giant think he had been beaten by a nobody. He stood at the stern and shouted back across the water his true name, that it was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, who had blinded him. And the Cyclops, in his rage and his pain, lifted his hands to the heavens and prayed to his father, the god of the sea. He prayed that Odysseus might never reach his home, or, if he was fated to reach it, that he might come home late and broken, alone, in a stranger's ship, to find his house in ruin. And Poseidon, lord of the sea, heard his son's prayer. From that moment, the whole ocean became Odysseus's enemy. The 10-year exile had begun, and its cause was a single moment of a proud man refusing to stay silent. Had Odysseus simply held his tongue and let the giant believe that nobody had beaten him, the sea might have carried him home in peace within the month. Instead, for the sake of his own name, his own pride, he handed his enemy the one thing the giant needed to curse him: his true name, spoken aloud across the water. It is the great irony at the heart of his whole story, that the cleverest man alive doomed himself for 10 years with a single boast. For a time, fortune seemed to turn. They came to the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, who welcomed them kindly. And when they left, he gave Odysseus a marvelous gift: a great leather bag, in which he had bound all the storm winds of the world, so that only a single gentle breeze remained to carry the ships safely home. For 9 days and nights they sailed, and on the 10th, Odysseus saw at last the shores of his own island of Ithaca, so close that he could see the little fires of the people on the hills. He had made it. Home was there before his eyes. But then, exhausted, he fell asleep at the helm, and his men, who had watched him guard that mysterious bag so jealously, whispered to one another that it must be full of gold and treasure, that he meant to keep for himself. And so, with home in sight, they opened the bag. All the winds of the world burst free at once in a shrieking storm, and hurled the ships back across all the sea they had crossed, away from Ithaca, back to the island of Aeolus, who now turned them away in horror, certain that a man so hated by the gods, must be cursed beyond all help. Home had been within sight, and his own men had thrown it away. It was the cruelest pattern of the whole journey. Time and again, Odysseus's cleverness or his good fortune brought them within reach of safety, and time and again, the weakness of his men, their greed, or their fear, or their inability simply to trust and wait, snatched it away again. He could master monsters and outwit gods. What he could never master were the ordinary human flaws of the men who sailed beside him. Worse followed. They came to the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of giant cannibals, who fell upon the fleet as it lay in harbor and crushed the ships with boulders hurled from the cliffs, spearing the men in the water like fish. Of the 12 ships that had left Troy, 11 were destroyed in that single harbor with all their crews. Only Odysseus's own ship, which he had cautiously moored outside the harbor mouth, escaped. In a single afternoon, the great fleet was gone, and only one ship and one crew remained of all the men who had followed him from the war. And still the journey was far from over, and still the sea was not finished with him. The one surviving ship came next to the island of Circe, a beautiful and dangerous enchantress, a goddess who lived alone in a hall in the forest, surrounded by wolves and lions that were strangely gentle, for they were men she had bewitched. Odysseus sent half his remaining men to explore, and Circe welcomed them warmly and set before them a feast. But the food was drugged, and the moment they had eaten, she touched them with her wand and turned them all into pigs and drove them squealing into her sties. There was something peculiarly cruel in the enchantment, for, though their bodies became those of swine, their minds remained their own, so that each man knew exactly what he had become, and could only weep behind the eyes of a beast. It was a fate worse than death, and the same fate waited for Odysseus himself, if his cleverness should fail him even once. One man alone had hung back, suspicious, and he ran to Odysseus with the terrible news. And so Odysseus set out alone to rescue his men, knowing no way to fight a goddess. But on the path he was met by the god Hermes, who gave him a secret, a magical herb that would protect him from Circe's magic, and instructions on how to master her. And so, when Circe struck him with her wand, and it failed, and he drew his sword as Hermes had told him, the enchantress fell back in amazement, for it had been prophesied that only one man could ever resist her magic. And she knew, when her wand failed, that he had come at last. The herb the god Hermes had given him, a white flower with a black root, which the gods called moly, and which no mortal could safely pull from the earth, had turned her spell aside completely. Faced with the one man her power could not touch, the enchantress changed at once from an enemy into a gracious host. Circe turned his men back from pigs into men, and she was no longer an enemy but a friend, and Odysseus and his crew stayed on her island, feasting and resting for a full year, until at last his men reminded him, gently, of the home he had almost let himself forget. For a full year they had lingered in Circe's hall, wanting for nothing, and Odysseus himself, for all his longing, had let the time slip quietly by in comfort and forgetting. Proof that even the strongest heart can be lulled to sleep by ease, no less surely than by the lotus, and their leaving was marked by a small sorrow too. One of his men, a young sailor named Elpenor, had climbed to the roof of Circe's hall to sleep, and in the confusion of departure had fallen and been killed, and his body left behind unburied. A little grief that would rise to meet Odysseus again, sooner than he could have imagined, and in a far darker place. But Circe told him that, before he could go home, he must first do something no living man had ever willingly done. He must sail to the very edge of the world, and go down into the land of the dead itself, and there seek out the ghost of a blind prophet named Tiresias, the only one who could tell him how to find his way home. It was a journey into the deepest fear of every mortal heart. Odysseus sailed to the dark edge of the ocean, to a sunless place wrapped in eternal mist, and there he performed the rites Circe had taught him, and the spirits of the dead came crowding up out of the darkness to meet him. He saw the ghosts of the great heroes he had fought beside at Troy. Achilles, who told him, heartbreakingly, that he would rather be a poor living servant on earth than a king among all the dead. He saw the ghost of his own mother, who had died of grief waiting for him to come home, and 3 times he tried to embrace her, and 3 times his arms passed through empty air. He met other ghosts in that gray and misty place, and each of them had something to teach him. The spirit of Agamemnon, who had led the whole Greek army at Troy, told him how he had survived 10 years of war, only to be murdered by his own wife, the very hour he came home. A dark and pointed warning about what can await a returning king, and about the difference between a faithless wife and a faithful one. There was the ghost of great Ajax, who had taken his own life over a bitter quarrel with Odysseus after the war, and who now, even in death, was so consumed by his grudge that he turned away in silence, and would not speak a single word. That, no matter how, Odysseus pleaded, a reminder that some wounds outlast even life itself. And there, newly come among the dead, drifted the shade of young Elpenor, the sailor left unburied on Circe's roof, who begged his captain to sail back and give his body its proper rights, so that he might finally rest. And he found the blind prophet, who told him the truth he needed. He could still reach home, Tiresias said, but only if, when he came at last to a certain island, he and his men could master their hunger and leave untouched the cattle that grazed there. For those cattle belonged to the sun god himself, and if the men laid a single hand upon them, Tiresias warned, his ship and all his crew would be destroyed, and Odysseus would come home late, and alone, and broken, to a house full of trouble. Remember those cattle. The whole fate of his crew now rested on a single act of restraint. Returning from the land of the dead, Odysseus faced the last and strangest gauntlet of his journey. First came the Sirens, creatures whose song was so unbearably beautiful that any sailor who heard it would steer his ship onto the rocks to reach them and die. Odysseus longed to hear that song and live, so he had his men fill their own ears with wax, and then bind him tightly to the mast, with strict orders never to release him, no matter how he begged. And, as the ship passed the island, the Sirens sang, and their song promised to tell him all the secrets of the world. And Odysseus strained and screamed against his ropes and begged his men to set him free. But they only bound him tighter and rode on until the deadly music faded behind them. He had heard the song that kills and lived, the only man ever to do so. The Sirens had sung to him that they knew all that had happened at Troy, and all that would ever happen anywhere upon the earth, and that he had only to come to them, and he would sail away wiser than any man alive. It was the most dangerous promise of all. Not pleasures, but knowledge, the one temptation a clever man could never quite laugh off. And all around there, flowering meadow, hidden in the long grass, lay the whitening bones of every sailor who had ever believed them. Then came the narrowest and most terrible passage of all, a strait guarded on both sides by monsters. On one side was Charybdis, a vast whirlpool that 3 times a day swallowed the whole sea and vomited it up again, and would drink down any ship that came too close. And on the other side, in a cave high in the cliff, lived Scylla, a horror with 6 long necks and 6 heads, each with 3 rows of teeth, who snatched sailors from the decks of passing ships. There was no safe path. To avoid the whirlpool that would destroy them all, Odysseus had to sail close to Scylla. And as they passed, the monster reached down and seized 6 of his men, 1 for each head, and lifted them screaming into the air. Odysseus said it was the most pitiful thing his eyes ever saw in all his wanderings, his men, calling out his name, carried up to be devoured, and nothing he could do to save them. He had traded 6 lives to save the rest. There was no other way through. To pass that strait at all was to accept in advance that some of your men were going to die, and to choose only which danger would kill them. Odysseus had not even told his crew that Scylla was waiting, for he knew that if they saw her coming, they would freeze in terror or scatter from the oars, and then the whirlpool would surely take them all. So he carried that knowledge alone and let 6 men die without warning, because the only other choice was for every soul aboard to die together. And then, at last, they came to the island Tiresias had warned him of, the island of the cattle of the sun. Odysseus, remembering the prophecy, begged his men to sail past it and not to land at all. But the men were exhausted and starving, and they swore they would only rest for a single night and touch nothing. And Odysseus, against his better judgment, allowed it. But then the winds turned against them and trapped them on the island for a month, and their food ran out, and hunger gnawed at them day after day. And one day, while Odysseus was asleep, his starving men gave in at last. They rounded up the finest of the sun god's cattle and slaughtered them and feasted. When Odysseus woke and saw what they had done, he knew with a cold dread that they were all doomed. The sun god demanded justice from Zeus, and Zeus granted it. When the ship finally left the island, a great storm rose up, and a thunderbolt from Zeus himself struck the vessel and shattered it to pieces, and every single one of Odysseus's men was drowned. All of them. After everything they had survived together, they died for one meal, exactly as the prophet had foretold. And Odysseus alone was left alive, clinging to a broken piece of his ship, adrift and utterly alone upon the empty sea. The storm even carried him back, a second time, toward the deadly whirlpool of Charybdis, and he saved himself only by leaping and catching the branches of a wild fig tree that overhung the water, and hanging there like a bat, while the sea was swallowed and spat up in the churning dark beneath his feet, until at last his broken timbers floated back up within his reach. He had lost his ship. He had lost every last one of the men who had followed him from Troy. Everything and everyone he had set out with was gone, and still the sea was not finished with him. For days he drifted, until the current carried him at last to the island of a goddess named Calypso. And here the greatest test of all began. Not a monster, and not a storm, but a temptation gentle enough to last for 7 years. For Calypso loved Odysseus, and she wished to keep him with her forever. And she offered him a gift beyond any that a mortal could dream of. She offered him immortality. She promised that if he stayed with her, he would never grow old and never die, but live forever, young and untroubled, on her beautiful island at the still center of the world. All he had to do was give up his home, give up his aging, faithful wife, who might well be dead by now, give up the rocky little kingdom that he could barely even remember, and in exchange he could live like a god forever. And here is the strange and beautiful heart of the whole story. Odysseus said no. Every evening, they say, he would go down to the shore and sit and look out across the sea toward the home he could not reach, and weep. He would rather grow old and die on his own poor island with his own mortal wife than live forever in paradise as another woman's guest. He chose home. He chose his own mortal life with all its sorrow over an eternity that was not his. And it was that refusal, that stubborn, aching love of home, that finally moved the gods to pity. 7 years he spent on that island, longer than the whole Trojan War had lasted, held not in a prison of stone, but in a paradise he did not want. It is perhaps the strangest captivity in all of the old stories. A loving goddess, an endless summer, the offer of eternal youth, and a man who wept upon the shore every single day to leave it. For Odysseus understood something the goddess never could, that a life without end, in a place that was not his own, among people who were not his own, was not truly a life at all. It was only a golden kind of forgetting. At last the goddess Athena, his old protector, went before Zeus and pleaded his cause, and Zeus commanded Calypso to let Odysseus go. She helped him build a raft, and he set out once more across the sea, and even now. Poseidon, catching sight of him, sent one last storm to smash the raft to splinters. But Odysseus, battered and half drowned, swam and clung to life for 2 days and 2 nights, and washed up at last, naked and broken, on the shore of a kind and gentle people called the Phaeacians. He was found there by a young princess named Nausicaa, who had come down to the river mouth with her handmaidens to wash the palace linen, and who did not run in fear from the wild, salt-crusted stranger, who crawled out of the bushes but took pity on him, and gave him clothing and food, and showed him the way to her father's palace. The Phaeacians were a gentle, seafaring people, and at the court of their king, Odysseus was welcomed as an honored guest. Before they even knew his name, they held games and feasts for the stranger, and it was there when a blind courtier began, by chance, to sing of the great deeds of the Greeks at Troy, of the wooden horse and the cunning of Odysseus, that the guest was seen to bow his head and weep quietly behind his hands. And the king asked him, gently at last, who he truly was. They took him in. They fed him and clothed him, and they listened, spellbound, as he told them the whole story of his wanderings, the Cyclops, the witch, the land of the dead, the monsters, the loss of every man he had led. And when he had finished, these good people, moved by his tale, gave him passage home at last. They laid him, sleeping, aboard one of their magical ships, and they carried him across the sea in a single night, and set him down, still sleeping, upon a quiet shore. That last kindness cost the Phaeacians dearly, for Poseidon, enraged that this gentle people had carried his enemy home in defiance of his will, struck their ship as it returned, and turned it to stone within sight of their own harbor. A final, bitter reminder of just how deep the sea god's anger against Odysseus still ran, even at the very end of the journey. When Odysseus awoke, he was home. After 20 years, 10 at war and 10 lost at sea, he was standing at last on the soil of Ithaca. But his trials were not over. In some ways, the hardest one was only just beginning. For Ithaca was not the peaceful home he had left. In the 20 years he had been gone, everyone had assumed he was dead. Everyone but his wife, Penelope, and his son, Telemachus, who had been only a baby when his father sailed for Troy and was now a grown man. For all those 20 years, the boy Telemachus had grown up fatherless, in a house being slowly eaten alive by strangers. And in truth, the story of the homecoming begins not with Odysseus at all, but with his son, a young man aching to know whether his father was alive or dead, and too powerless to drive the suitors from his own hall. Guided by the goddess Athena, who came to him disguised as an old family friend, Telemachus at last found the courage to set out on a quiet journey of his own, sailing in secret to the mainland to seek news of his father from the old heroes who had survived the war. He came to age Nestor at Pylos and to Menelaus and Helen in their palace at Sparta. Helen, whose beauty had begun the whole war, now grown older and living quietly at home, as though none of it had ever happened. And there Telemachus learned the first thread of hope, that his father was not dead, but alive and held far away on the island of a goddess, across all the width of the world. Without yet knowing it, father and son had at last begun to move toward one another. And in those years, the house of Odysseus had been invaded. More than 100 arrogant young noblemen from Ithaca and the islands around it had moved into his palace as suitors, each one demanding that Penelope choose one of them as her new husband, and declare Odysseus dead. Day after day they sat in his hall, eating his food, drinking his wine, insulting his servants, and slowly devouring his wealth, while they waited for the faithful queen to give in. Penelope had held them off for years with a clever trick of her own. She said she would choose a husband only when she had finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's old father, and every day she wove, and every night she secretly unraveled her work, so that the weaving was never done. For 20 years she had kept faith. She had raised their son alone and held a kingdom together. and turned away 100 suitors, clinging to a hope that everyone around her called foolish, the hope that her husband was still alive, and still, somewhere far across the world, fighting his way home to her. Her faithfulness is the quiet mirror of his longing. He crossed the whole earth to reach her. She held the whole world at bay to wait for him. In the end, the story is as much her tale of endurance as it is his. But the trick had at last been discovered, and now the suitors were pressing harder than ever. Odysseus had come home, but he had come home to a house full of enemies, and he was one man against 100. So, the cleverest man in the world did what he had always done. He did not charge in with his sword. He came in disguise. The goddess Athena transformed him into the likeness of an old, ragged beggar, and in that humble form he entered his own palace, unrecognized, to see for himself who had remained loyal and who had not. It was a bitter homecoming. He watched the suitors mock and abuse the old beggar, throwing things at him, laughing at him in his own hall. He bore it all in silence, swallowing his pride and his anger, watching and remembering, noting which of the suitors were the cruelest and which of his old servants had stayed loyal and which had gone over to the thieves. It took a strength of a different kind than any he had shown at Troy, not to strike, not to speak, but to wait, disguised and insulted in his own home, until the single right moment came. He revealed himself in secret, only to his son, Telemachus, and together, father and son, they began quietly to plan. In those first days home, disguised as a beggar, Odysseus learned who had stayed true to him. He found his old swineherd, Eumaeus, a humble servant who still spoke of his lost master with love and loyalty. After 20 years, and who welcomed the ragged stranger into his poor hut and shared his food, never dreaming that it was the king himself. And there was a moment when Odysseus came very close to being discovered far too soon. His old childhood nurse, Eurycleia, now aged and half-blind, was told to wash the beggar's feet, and as her hands moved over his leg, they found an old scar, a scar he had carried since boyhood, from a wound taken long ago while hunting a wild boar. She knew that scar at once. She looked up at his face, and her eyes filled with tears, and her mouth opened to cry out his name in joy. And Odysseus caught her gently but firmly, and whispered to her to be silent. For a single word now would ruin everything, and cost them all their lives. The old woman understood, and swallowed her joy, and kept his secret. The trap had very nearly sprung too early. Now, everything had to wait for exactly the right moment. And there was one heartbreaking moment as he entered that he could not have planned for. Lying neglected on a dung heap by the gate was an old dog named Argos, the very dog Odysseus had raised as a puppy 20 years before he left for the war. The dog was ancient now, and covered in fleas, and too weak to rise. But when the disguised Odysseus passed by, old Argos knew him. After 20 years, the dog alone knew his master at once. He could not get up, but he lifted his head, and he wagged his tail once. And then, having seen his master come home at last, the old dog closed his eyes and died. And Odysseus, unable to break his disguise, had to look away and wipe a single tear and walk on. The reckoning, when it came, turned upon a clever test. Penelope, weary at last, and believing her husband truly dead, announced that she would hold a contest and marry whichever of the suitors could perform a feat that only Odysseus himself had ever managed: to string his great old war bow and shoot a single arrow cleanly through the round openings of 12 axe heads set in a row. One after another, the arrogant young suitors tried, and one after another they failed. Not one of them was even strong enough to bend the great bow and string it. And then the ragged old beggar in the corner asked, to their jeering laughter, if he might try. He took up the bow, and in the sudden hush of that hall, the old beggar strung the mighty bow as easily as a musician strings a lyre, and set an arrow to it, and sent it flying clean through all 12 axe heads in a single perfect shot. For a heartbeat, no one in that hall moved or breathed. The impossible had been done, the feat that belonged to one man and one man alone. And every suitor in the room understood, in the same cold instant, exactly what it meant, and who was standing before them. And in that moment, the beggar stood tall, and threw off his rags, and the suitors saw too late exactly who had been sitting among them. It was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, come home at last. And now he turned the great bow upon the men who had devoured his house. He had chosen his moment perfectly. The doors of the hall were barred. The suitors' own weapons had been quietly carried away and hidden. And the one man in all the world who could use that bow now stood between them and the only way out. All the long years of patience, all the swallowed insults, all the waiting in rags, everything had been for this. What followed was swift and terrible. With his son at his side, and the help of the goddess, Athena, and a few faithful servants, Odysseus fell upon the suitors in his own great hall. They had come as thieves into another man's home, and they had mocked the gods and the sacred bond between a host and his guests. And now the reckoning was upon them, and there was no escape from that sealed hall. When it was over, the long injustice was ended, and the house of Odysseus was his own again. In the aftermath, the servants who had kept faith through all the long years were rewarded, and those who had sided with the suitors and mocked their absent king faced a hard justice of their own. 20 years of insult and waste were paid for in a single evening, and the great hall, which for so long had echoed with the laughter of thieves, fell silent at last, and was cleansed and made ready to be a home again. But there was still one reunion left, the one that mattered most of all, and the one he had crossed 20 years of war and sea to reach. For even now, Penelope would not quite believe it. She had been deceived and disappointed too many times, and she dared not let herself hope that the man in her hall was truly her husband, and not some god or trickster wearing his face. So she set him one final test, a test that only the real Odysseus could ever pass. She calmly instructed a servant to move their marriage bed out of the bedchamber to make it ready for the stranger. And Odysseus, hearing this, reacted with sudden anger, because he alone knew that their bed could not be moved. He had built it himself long ago, and one of its great posts was a living olive tree, still rooted in the earth, around which he had built their whole bedroom with his own hands. No one could move that bed without cutting down the tree, And when Penelope heard him describe the secret that only she and he and one servant had ever known, she knew at last, beyond all doubt, that this was truly her husband, come home. And she ran to him at last, and threw her arms around him, and wept, and would not let him go. After 20 years, the long wandering was over. Odysseus was home. There was one last reunion still to come. The next morning, Odysseus went out into the countryside to find his old father, Laertes, who in his grief for his lost son had left the palaces altogether and gone to live simply on a farm, tending his orchard with his own hands. An old man worn down by sorrow. And there, among the trees his father had once shown him as a boy, Odysseus made himself known and named to the old man each of the fruit trees Laertes had given him a lifetime ago, so that his father would know beyond doubt that this was truly his son, returned at last from the dead. But even this quiet joy was nearly shattered, for the families of the slain suitors rose up in anger, seeking revenge, and for a moment it seemed that Ithaca might tear itself apart in a new and endless feud. It was the goddess Athena herself who came down at the very end and commanded peace, who stilled the anger on both sides and bound the island together again, so that Odysseus might at last simply live in his own home with his wife and his son and his old father, in the quiet he had crossed the whole world to find. And so we return, at the very end, to the question we began with. Why did the cleverest man in the world spend 20 years lost and suffering when a simple voyage should have brought him home in weeks? And what, in the end, carried him through it all? It was not his strength. There were stronger men, and they died. It was not only his famous cunning, though his cunning saved his life 100 times. In the deepest sense, what brought Odysseus home was something the ancient Greeks had a special word for: nostos, the longing for home, the ache of return, from which we still get our word nostalgia. It was that ache that would not let him rest on the island of the lotus, or in the arms of a witch, or even in the offered arms of an immortal goddess. He was offered eternal life, and he turned it down, because it was not his life. He wanted his own small, mortal, difficult home, and his own aging wife, and the rocky little island where he belonged. There is something in that choice that reaches across 3,000 years and touches us still. For all of us, in the end, are traveling, carried far from where we began, tempted along the way to stop, to forget, to settle for something easier than the thing we truly long for. And the story of Odysseus quietly promises us that the longing itself is not foolish, that home is worth the whole width of the sea, that it is a kind of greatness and not a weakness, simply to keep going, through every storm and every loss, toward the place and the people that are truly ours. In an age of heroes who chased glory and died young, Odysseus is remembered for something quieter and stranger, for wanting, more than anything the gods could offer him, simply to go home, and in the end, against every monster and every god and the whole width of the sea, that longing was enough. Rest now, and let the sound of the sea carry you, as it carried him at last, all the way home.